I knew something had finally crossed the line the morning I walked down to my dock with a fresh cup of coffee and found 3 boats tied to it like somebody had assigned them permanent parking spaces. Nobody asked for permission. Nobody looked embarrassed. And 6 complete strangers were laughing on my dock as if they had been invited there all along. One man even lifted his hand and smiled at me like I worked for the marina. That was the exact moment I stopped trying to be the reasonable neighbor. My name is Ethan Mercer, and until last summer I honestly believed that if you stayed calm long enough, most problems eventually sorted themselves out. Looking back now, I realize patience only works when both sides actually respect boundaries. I live at the far end of a quiet gravel road outside the small lakeside town of Ashford, Wisconsin. My property sits where the shoreline curves into a peaceful cove, sheltered from the afternoon wind by tall pine trees that have probably stood there longer than anyone alive today. The cedar dock stretching 40 feet into the lake wasn't something I bought from a contractor. My grandfather built it himself over 50 years ago, driving every piling into the lake bed with equipment that would probably belong in a museum today. As a kid, I spent every summer fishing off that dock with my father. Years later, after he passed away, it became the place where I sat whenever life became too loud. Every sunrise looked different from those weathered cedar planks. Some mornings the lake looked like polished glass. Other mornings the fog floated so low across the water it felt like the entire world had disappeared except for me. The dock, and the sound of loons somewhere across the shoreline. It was the one place where I never felt rushed. Then the Harrison family bought the lake house 3 properties down. Nathan Harrison arrived with a brand new white performance speedboat that probably cost more than my first house. Mirrored sunglasses, expensive polo shirts, and the kind of confidence that made it seem like every rule in the world was written for someone else. His wife, Lauren, always smiled politely, but it was the kind of smile people wear when they're convinced they'll eventually get their way anyway. Within 2 weekends, they had transformed the quiet little cove into what looked like a private resort. Friends showed up every Friday afternoon towing boats behind oversized trucks. Coolers rolled across driveways. Portable speakers blasted country music across the lake until sunset. At first, I kept telling myself it wasn't worth making an issue out of. People buy lake houses because they enjoy the water. Everyone deserves a little fun during the short northern summer. I figured we'd eventually introduce ourselves over a fence or while checking the mailbox. Maybe laugh about first impressions and become decent neighbors. Instead, the first real conversation happened because I couldn't even reach my own dock. I came home one Friday planning to take my 14-foot fishing boat out before dinner, but 2 large wake boats had been tied directly across my dock. 8 people sat there eating sandwiches, drinking beer, and talking loudly like they were hosting a family reunion. Nobody even looked surprised to see me. One man nodded casually and said, "We'll only be another hour." Buddy. I stood there for a second, wondering if I had somehow walked onto somebody else's property by mistake. Then I realized he genuinely believed I was asking permission to use my own dock. I smiled as politely as I could. "Actually, this is my dock. I'd appreciate it if you'd move the boats." Nathan looked over from the back of his speedboat and laughed. "Relax. It's a public lake," I nodded. "The lake is public. The dock isn't." He shrugged like I had just corrected his grammar instead of pointing out basic property rights. "Come on, man. We're not hurting anything." Maybe that sentence bothered me more than anything else. People always say they're not hurting anything when they're talking about something that doesn't belong to them. After another 15 minutes, they finally untied the boats. They left muddy footprints across the cedar planks, empty drink cans sitting beside one of the benches, and fresh rope burns around 2 of my dock cleats. I spent the next half hour cleaning up after people I'd never even met. I told myself it had been an awkward misunderstanding. The next weekend, they came back. Then they came back again. Before long, it became part of their routine. Every Friday afternoon, Nathan's white speedboat appeared first. 10 minutes later, another boat arrived. Sometimes there were 3 tied side by side against my dock. They unloaded coolers, beach chairs, fishing gear, inflatable tubes, and enough supplies to spend the entire weekend there. Once I watched one of Nathan's friends plug a portable blender into the electrical outlet mounted beside my boathouse without asking. Another time I found children diving from the end of my dock while their parents watched from lawn chairs they had unfolded on my shoreline. The strange part wasn't that they ignored me. It was how completely normal they believed their behavior was. Every conversation ended exactly the same way. Nathan would grin. Lauren would sigh dramatically. Someone would tell me I needed to loosen up because neighbors share. One Saturday morning, I walked outside specifically to count because I wanted to make sure frustration wasn't exaggerating the situation in my own mind. 3 boats, 7 adults, 3 teenagers, 2 dogs running across my property. One woman I'd never met asked if I could take a group picture because I happened to be standing nearby. That was the moment something inside me became perfectly calm. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even offended. I simply realized these people weren't going to stop because I asked nicely. They had mistaken politeness for permission, and every weekend that passed convinced them a little more that my dock had quietly become part of their summer routine. That afternoon, I walked back inside, opened my laptop, pulled up every county property record connected to my shoreline, downloaded old survey maps, read through state riparian access regulations, and somewhere between decades-old legal documents and county registration forms, I discovered one small paragraph that completely changed the direction of the entire summer. Because according to the county, my dock qualified for something I had never even heard of before, a registered private mooring facility. I had lived on that lake for almost 18 years, and somehow I had never heard the phrase private mooring facility before. The more I read, the more I realized this wasn't some obscure loophole hidden deep inside a law book. It was simply a legal classification that almost nobody bothered using because most neighbors respected each other's property without needing government paperwork. My dock already sat on my deed as private riparian access, which meant I had the exclusive right to control who tied up there. Registering it simply gave the county harbor master direct authority to enforce unauthorized mooring without forcing me into endless personal arguments. I remember leaning back in my chair and laughing quietly to myself because for the first time all summer I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about procedure. There is something strangely comforting about paperwork when you've spent weeks arguing with people who refuse to listen to common sense. The following Monday, I drove to the county offices carrying copies of my deed, shoreline survey, tax assessment, and photographs showing the dock from every angle. The woman behind the counter looked through the documents, smiled, and said, "Honestly, we don't get many of these anymore. Most people don't realize they can register private docks." That sentence alone made me wonder how many property owners simply tolerated behavior they never actually had to accept. The process itself wasn't complicated. I completed the application, paid $112, signed several acknowledgments, and left with temporary documentation while the permanent registration was processed. 3 days later, I received the official certificate along with instructions explaining exactly how the dock had to be marked. I laminated 2 notices, mounted one on the entrance piling and another near the end of the dock where every approaching boat would see it before tying off. The signs weren't aggressive. They simply read, "Registered Private Mooring Facility, Written Authorization Required. Unauthorized vessels subject to county enforcement." I even added reflective tape so nobody could claim they hadn't noticed them after sunset. Then I photographed every sign with date and timestamps before emailing copies to the county office exactly as instructed. I wasn't trying to trap anyone. In fact, a small part of me hoped Nathan would see the signs, shrug, and start using the public marina less than a mile away. That would have been the easiest ending for everyone involved. Friday afternoon arrived with clear skies and barely a breeze. I was sitting on my screened porch pretending to read while quietly watching the cove through the railing. Around 3:30, I heard the familiar growl of Nathan's engine long before I saw the boat. He rounded the point exactly the way he had every weekend before, slowed beside my dock, looked directly at one of the new signs, and tied up anyway. I actually laughed out loud because I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. 10 minutes later, another ski boat arrived. The passengers glanced at the signs, pointed toward them, exchanged a few words I couldn't hear, and tied their ropes beside Nathan's without a second thought. It was almost impressive. They had ignored written notices with the same confidence they had ignored me all summer. I didn't walk down to the dock. I didn't wave. I didn't argue. Instead, I picked up my camera, stood on my porch, and calmly photographed both registration numbers, every rope attached to my cleats, and both warning signs clearly visible in the same frame. Then I noted the exact time in a notebook. Saturday morning, the boats were still there. Music started around noon. More people arrived. At one point, somebody dragged a large inflatable raft across my shoreline, while another guest carried a cooler straight across my yard without bothering to stay near the water. Around sunset, Nathan spotted me grilling burgers on my deck and raised a beer in my direction. "See, Ethan," he called. "Nobody's complaining." I smiled back. "Not today." He laughed because he thought I was joking. Sunday evening, both boats finally left. Monday morning, I emailed every photograph to the county harbor master along with copies of my registration and a short timeline documenting exactly when each vessel had occupied the dock. Less than 2 hours later, my phone rang. "Mr. Mercer," the officer said, "everything appears to be in order. If they return after receiving proper notice, we'll handle enforcement." That was it. No promises of dramatic arrests. No threats. Just a calm professional explaining the process. The following Friday became one of the quietest afternoons of my life because I wasn't wondering whether Nathan would come back. I was wondering whether arrogance could really outweigh common sense. Around 4 o'clock, his speedboat appeared once again. He slowed beside my dock, stared directly at the signs, shook his head almost dismissively, and secured both bow and stern lines exactly where he always had. A second boat followed 15 minutes later. By sunset, both vessels were sitting comfortably against my dock while laughter echoed across the cove. I made one phone call. Saturday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, a White County enforcement boat entered the cove so quietly that almost nobody noticed it until it was already approaching the dock. 2 uniformed officers stepped onto the planks, compared the registration number mounted on the piling with paperwork on a clipboard, photographed the unauthorized boats, and then politely asked if anyone present possessed written mooring authorization from the registered owner. The silence that followed lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt much longer. Nathan finally climbed out of his boat wearing the same confident smile I'd seen all summer. "Come on, officers," he said. "We've been docking here for months." One of the officers nodded politely. "That doesn't constitute authorization." "Sir." Nathan looked over at me standing quietly near my porch. "Seriously, Ethan? You called the county?" I answered honestly. "No. I reported unauthorized mooring at a registered private facility. The county handled the rest." His smile disappeared for the first time since I met him. The officers explained the violation, completed their paperwork, and radioed for the contracted towing vessel already waiting just outside the cove. Within 20 minutes, heavy lines had been attached to both boats. Neighbors quietly stepped outside onto their decks as the tow captain slowly pulled the first wake boat away from my dock. Nobody yelled. Nobody resisted. The entire operation felt almost disappointingly calm, which somehow made it even more satisfying. Nathan stood with his hands on his hips, watching tens of thousands of dollars worth of fiberglass disappear behind the towboat. Before leaving, one officer handed him a printed information sheet explaining where the boats had been taken, the retrieval procedure, and the applicable fees. $400 per vessel for the impound, plus daily storage charges beginning immediately. As the county boats disappeared around the point, the lake became quiet again. Quiet enough that I could finally hear the wind moving through the pine trees behind my house. I honestly thought the whole thing was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. Around 7 that evening, my doorbell rang so hard I thought the glass might crack. Nathan stood on my porch, red-faced from the sun and even redder with anger, waving the impound paperwork in one hand. "You happy now?" he snapped. "You turned a neighbor dispute into a government problem." I looked at the papers, then back at him. "No, Nathan. You turned a simple request into a government problem the day you decided my property didn't belong to me." Nathan stood there waiting for me to apologize, or maybe argue, but I didn't feel like doing either. I walked inside, grabbed a folder from the kitchen counter, and came back holding the same documents I had spent weeks collecting. "Here," I said calmly, "that's the county registration. Those are the photos showing your boats tied to my dock after the warning signs were installed. That's the timeline I submitted. And this," I pulled one final sheet from the folder, "is the county ordinance explaining exactly why they were impounded." He looked at the paperwork for only a second before shoving it back toward me. "This is harassment." I shook my head. "No, Nathan. Harassment would have been me calling every weekend just to ruin your day. I asked you politely for almost 2 months. I gave you more chances than I should have. Then I put up signs. Then I waited another week. You ignored every single opportunity to solve this without involving anyone else." He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. For the first time since we'd met, he didn't have a clever comeback. He simply stared at the papers as though they had betrayed him. "You could have just talked to me," he muttered. I couldn't help smiling a little. "Nathan, that's exactly what I did." Repeatedly, he left without another word. slamming my screen door hard enough to rattle the frame. I figured that would be the end of it, but reality has a funny way of letting consequences do the talking. Over the next several days, the storage fees kept increasing. Every sunrise, the impound yard added another charge. By the time Nathan finally managed to arrange transportation and paperwork, the bill had climbed high enough that suddenly using the public marina didn't seem so inconvenient anymore. About a week later, I was repairing one of the dock benches when I noticed his truck slowly pulling into my driveway. This time he wasn't angry. He wasn't smiling either. He looked tired. He walked toward me carrying a manila envelope instead of waving his arms around. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I nodded and set my tools down. He took a deep breath before speaking. "I should have listened the first time you asked." Those were probably the last words I ever expected to hear from him. "The towing fees weren't cheap," he admitted with an awkward laugh. "My insurance wouldn't cover any of it because technically we were trespassing." Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Finally, he glanced at the dock and asked, "So, if someone actually wanted permission to tie up here once in a while, what would that look like?" I reached into the same folder I had carried all summer and handed him a simple one-page agreement I drafted after speaking with the county. It wasn't complicated. 30-day minimum authorization. Payment in advance. Maximum number of vessels. No overnight mooring without written approval. No guests beyond the registered boats. Leave the dock exactly as you found it. Violate the agreement once and it was terminated immediately. Nathan read every line this time instead of laughing. "These are your rules?" he asked. "It's my property," I answered. "So yes." He looked out across the lake for a long moment before signing his name. Not because he liked the agreement, but because he had finally understood something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Respecting someone else's property is always cheaper than assuming you can borrow it forever. The funny part is that once everything was official, we barely had any problems at all. Whenever he or one of his friends wanted to use the dock, they sent a text first. If the dock was available, great. If it wasn't, they accepted the answer without complaint. The loud music disappeared. Nobody crossed my lawn anymore. My outdoor electrical outlets somehow stopped being public property overnight. Even the neighbors who had quietly watched the entire situation unfold started introducing themselves instead of pretending everybody's shoreline belonged to everyone else. One evening near the end of summer, I was sitting on the dock watching the sunset when an older neighbor from across the cove idled over in his fishing boat. He smiled and said, "You know, a lot of us wanted to do what you did years ago. We just never thought it was worth the trouble." I smiled back. Honestly, neither did I, until it became more trouble not to. Looking back now, I don't think the biggest lesson had anything to do with boats or paperwork. It was learning that being a good neighbor doesn't mean surrendering your boundaries. Kindness without limits eventually becomes permission. And once people get comfortable benefiting from your silence, they often mistake it for agreement. The law didn't create respect between us. It simply reminded everyone where respect should have started in the first place. Even now, every morning I still carry my coffee down those same weathered cedar planks. The lake is quiet again. The sunrise still turns the water copper. The only difference is that when I look out across the cove, every boat tied to my dock is there because someone asked first. And somehow that simple act of respect makes the view even better than it was before. So now I'm curious, did I overreact by letting the county handle something that started as a neighbor dispute? Or was that exactly what should happen when polite conversations fail? If you were in my position, would you have kept giving second chances? Or would you have made the same call? Let me know what you honestly think in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with entitled neighbors who thought your property was theirs to use, I'd love to hear your story too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.